The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on various pricing strategies along with related topics on pricing and marketing defaults in Design Manager. My name is Brad, and I'll be hosting a demonstration today. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to enter them into the questions pane on your GoToWebinar panel. If the question is outside of the scope of today's discussion, please email them to support@designmanager.com. And lastly, if you miss a portion of the webinar or want to review any of our past discussions, go to our YouTube channel at Design Manager Inc., Design Manager INC, and you can see any of our past tutorials, project management courses, and all of our weekly webinars as well. Now, as you can hear, I'm a bit hoarse as I'm coming off a little bit of the flu, but here at Design Manager, we put our clients first. So I'm going to ignore any personal discomfort and persevere with our demonstration today. So let's get started. Design Manager has three primary methods of calculating the price of goods and services to your client, all of which can be used interchangeably as the situation requires. Further, such pricing strategies can be configured as company and or project-wide defaults, and they also work in conjunction with other methods of overriding or standardizing pricing configurations. Now, as the concepts we'll be discussing are nearly identical in both the Design Manager Cloud and the Professional Cloud platforms, I'll be demonstrating predominantly in the Pro Cloud platform to sort of minimize the distraction between going between both programs. So let's begin with the three pricing methods available in Design Manager. And I've already configured a project in our Pro Cloud to easily demonstrate each of them. So we'll go to our project specifications. I'm going to pull up one of my Hilson projects, and you can see I've already created these three items, each of which are using a different pricing model. The first of which being marking up the cost. In this case, we're going to have the cost from the vendor and a certain percentage that we're going to add on to that cost as our profit. This is also known as cost plus pricing, cost plus our markup. So let me edit my item 5 here. And you can see I've created some instructions for myself within the client description. We're going to have a cost of $1,000 per unit, and we're going to mark it up 30%. Now, to input all of our cost pricing information, we go down to the component window, unless I'm going to enter it in directly onto the item with no calculations itself. I could just put in the cost and the price desired. But any of the more advanced pricing calculations are always done at the component level. So we'll click on our edit button as indicated by the pencil. And we can see I already have my markup pricing type, which has a menu for the other two types, which we'll discuss next, listed, and the percent that I'd like to mark up the good. So all I need to do now is enter in my cost, which I said the unit of which is $1,000. Remember, in Design Manager, you don't need to put in decimals if you're going to have a rounded figure like 1,000. I don't need to put in 1,000.00. I could just put in 1,000, and Design Manager will reformat it for me. My quantity was 2, so my extended cost, of course, would be $2,000. And then I'm going to mark it up 30%. And if we quickly grab our calculator, I can see that 2,000 times 0.3 is indeed $600, and we add that back to our original cost of $2,000 for a selling price of $2,600, which is exactly what we see Design Manager doing for us. So we're taking our cost, marking it up by the desired percentage, and allowing Design Manager to calculate the sell price for us. Now, of course, this works the other way. I always have full control over my pricing. I might just say, hey, I want to round this to an even 3,000 for the client. So I could input 3,000 directly into my sell price, and then Design Manager will recalculate both the markup amount and the percentage for me. So remember, you always have full control over your pricing. Let's go back to our 30% for our example, though. Now, in this method, cost plus, obviously the cost and the sell price are very interconnected. As soon as we change the cost, the price is going to automatically update. But there may be a situation when I don't want the cost to affect the price. Let's imagine that the vendor came back to us and said, hey, for whatever reason, I'm going to charge you $800 per unit rather than the $1,000 I originally quoted. Now, if I change the unit cost to $800, the sell price will be reduced by the proportional amount. But if I wanted to lock or maintain my $2,600 sell price, I can use the lock pricing feature. And if you notice, there's a very tiny blue lock right next to the sell price. And if I click it, notice that my pricing type changes from markup to discount, and I'm using a discount percentage of 0. But what has happened here is I've untethered the cost from the sell price. So now if I change my unit cost, no effect occurs on the sell price itself. So that's a very unique sort of hidden feature in Design Manager, that you can always sort of lock your price even when you're using the cost plus or markup pricing method. Let's go ahead and save our item. And speaking of discount mode, that leads us to our second pricing structure, where we're going to discount off of list. In this circumstances, your vendors provided you a list price or a retail price that the client would see on the vendor's website or catalog or what have you. And what we're going to do is tell the client that we're going to offer them a discount off of that list price just by using us as their purchasing agent or going through us for our design services, knowing that we can, of course, get the cost of the good for even a lower amount. So let's edit that item. And we'll see in my example, I'm going to again maintain my $1,000 cost per unit. And in this case, I'm going to use a list price per unit or a unit list price of just under $2,000 at $19.95. Let's go down to our component window, and we can see I'm already in my discount mode, and the window is slightly different than it would be under the cost markup model. And I can change my discount percentage to 35%. So my cost here again would be 1,000. I extend it out to 2,000 with a quantity of 2. And my unit list, as I said, was $19.95. Again, we extend that out to $39.90, but Design Manager's calculating the discount off of list for me and the ultimate sell price to the client, which is just shy of our $2,600 that we used in our markup model. So whichever method you prefer, you can always get the desired price or the desired profit on your item. And just by clicking OK, we save that item as well. Generally, I would say that those are the two most common methods, perhaps the markup being the most common. The third method we're going to discuss today is a design or purchasing fee method. Now, in this model, which is commonly used by design firms that are acting as purchasing agents or agent for, where the clients are very often commercial clients who are paying the vendors directly. The design firm makes their profit by procuring the orders, maintaining the orders, processing them, etc., and they get their fee as a percentage of the cost itself, even though the client is paying for the cost directly. Now that's a long-winded description, but let's see what I mean by that. So in this case, we have our design purchasing fee. Our cost again is still 1,000, and we're going to have a 15% purchasing fee. We're down to our component level. I have my percent type now set to fee, and we'll put in our 15%. And notice the window here looks very different. Rather than saying unit cost, I'm saying unit base cost and extended base cost. Well, that's because the cost I input here is going to be the basis for what my ultimate selling price is as calculated by my fee percentage. So if our cost is 1,000, again, that extends out to a $2,000 base cost. My sell price in this case is only 300. It's only the 15% of our 2,000. I'm not including the cost in that price as we did in the markup model. My price to the client is only the purchasing fee itself. And if we click OK here, Notice on the item window, there is no cost. I don't actually have a cost in this circumstance because the client's paying for the goods themselves directly. But I do, of course, maintain that base cost. So those are our three standard models of pricing structure in Design Manager. And I used all three of them in a single project for our demonstration. That's generally obviously unusual. Now, you may want to configure your projects to always utilize a particular pricing model and the specific percentages in a pre-configured circumstance, so you don't have to worry about it. Let Design Manager handle all the automation for you. And you can do so on your project window. Let's go down to our Hilson Wine Cellar project, edit, go to the Defaults tab, click the Advanced Markup button, and on our Project Advanced Options window, we can see we have for each of our component types can individually be configured for any of the three pricing types and the appropriate percentages. So for the Hilson project, I'm marking up my merchandise by 30%, while I'm marking up my freight at 10%. And it's the exact same for our Design Manager Cloud users. You would go to your project and specifications, edit your project, go to the Defaults tab, and click Advanced again. And there you can see the exact same structure. Now let's go back to our specifications. Notice that I had my freight marked up at 10%. So if we go back to our item 5, I could add a second item for freight. In freight is our description. I can change my component type from merchandise, which is the default, to freight. And notice when I do so, the 30% automatically goes down to 10. And I could even do the exact same thing if I'm using freight as an associated charge or component. So if I edit component 1, the primary merchandise component, I could go down to my additional charges area, select freight, and again, the markup is immediately set to 10% rather than the 30% that's configured for merchandise. Put $100 in there, and I calculate the price at $110 for the client. And there we go. So each of the component types on a per project basis can have their own pricing model and percentages. And of course, I may want to have these as a very standardized set of pricing on the company level, where you can do that as well. If we go to File, Company Information and Settings, on the Company Information window, click your Advanced button, and jump over to the General tab, and there you can see I can configure the company. And at this point, any new project would automatically inherit or have those defaults set up. So I don't have to do so every time on a per project basis. And then the same for our Design Manager Cloud users. And just go to your File, Company Settings, click the Advanced button, and there you can see the same configuration on the General tab of the Advanced Options window. Now, in a final example, there may be circumstances in various states or locales where your design fee or your markup may be taxed at a different rate than the cost of the merchandise, or may not be taxed at all. So those two pieces, the coordination of the cost and your markup or design fee, need to be separated so they can be taxed appropriately. So in those cases, you need to have one component for your merchandise and a second for your design fee or purchasing fee. To add each of those in manually every time is a little bit tedious. So we've configured a way that that can be automated for you. And let me show how that works. Let's go back to our company, let's go to our Hilson Wine Cellar, go back to our defaults, back to our advanced options. My design fee is already set to 15%, but let's imagine that in my case, the cost of the merchandise is taxable, but the purchasing fee or design services is not. So I'm not going to mark up the cost, but I will do a 30% fee. And I'm going to use the auto setting. So what that indicates is for every merchandise component that I enter, Design Manager is going to automatically create a design fee component for me. So I don't need to do so myself. That's a very convenient feature if you always want to have a freight component created for you for every merchandise, or if your design firm always has interstate charges or those types of things associated with every merchandise component. Having Design Manager automatically create it for you just streamlines the entire process. So let's save those settings. Go back to our items. Let's add a new one. Let's say this is merchandise with design fee auto. To furniture. Now, remember I changed my merchandise markup to 0. Design Manager is automatically doing that for me. But what did occur is I've already got an associated charge for design fee listed with our 30%. And in our case, the cost is taxable, but our design fee isn't. So again, having that pre-configured settings done properly really streamlines the process and ensures you don't make mistakes inadvertently. So if our cost here, $1,000, I have my price of the merchandise to the client at $1,000, but Design Manager is already calculating my non-taxable fee of 30% for a $300 charge to the client. And any changes I make, let's say the cost actually increases, Design Manager will automatically change that for me as well. And I could even have a markup if I wanted to. So I could have an automatic design fee being calculated and still mark up the cost 10%. So my sell price increases and my purchasing fee increases as well. So that's a very convenient method if you're in a location where your merchandise and design fee or purchasing fee are taxed at different rates, or one is taxed and the other is not. Okay, now all of these prices and costs flow right into our proposals and purchase orders respectively, as you would of course imagine. Now, Design Manager does have another layer of sophistication to allow you to further customize your final default invoice price to the client. Let's go over those briefly. We'll go back to my projects window and we'll edit our familiar Hilson project. Defaults, advanced again. I'm going to reset our configurations to where they were. But now I'm going to jump over to the Invoice tab. And we're paying particular attention to the pricing column here. And there's 3 selections for each of our component types. And here they are. The first selection is always proposal. What this means is whatever the current sell price is for an item and its components in the specifications is going to be the default invoice price to the client. So whatever I'm specifying, that's what I'll be, that'll be the price defaulted when I go to make an invoice. Now it's very convenient, particularly if we have a proposal generated and the client signs off on it, or we sign off on it and there's been a deposit sent, and we're honoring that proposal amount, regardless of what happens with us and the vendor as far as true costs go. So if there's any additional changes in the cost, increase or decrease from the vendor, it doesn't matter at all. We're still charging the client whatever we typed in our specifications. Now, in direct contrast to that is the always actual setting. And what this does is it looks at the actual or true cost of our merchandise and services from our vendors as recorded by the vendor invoices. Now, that's a very important point. If I'm not recording vendor invoices into Design Manager, I'm not generating any actual cost. And if my actual cost is 0, it doesn't matter what I mark it up, the actual price or the invoice price would be 0. So this method requires you to have your vendor invoices recorded prior to invoicing the client. But what it does do is it takes any increases or decreases in that cost and passes it on to the client. So if our cost was truly more than we anticipated from the vendor, that additional cost will then be the value that we're marking up rather than our estimated costs on our specifications. And just the same if it goes down. If the cost decreases, I'd pass on those savings when invoicing the client as well. Very common scenario for freight, for example. People will often use the always actual selection for freight. And lastly is the automatic. What the automatic selection does is it first calculates the always proposal value, then the always actual value, and takes the higher of the two. So if there's no vendor invoices recorded when you go to invoice, it's going to use the always proposal calculation. But if the vendor invoices are recorded and there was an increase in cost, well, Design Manager will pass that on. But if there's a decrease in cost, it'll use the always proposal method. So not only is it a catch-all to get any pricing configuration, but it'll always pass on any costs to the client, yet take any savings for ourselves. Now, why I bring this up in our discussion on pricing is that these pricing selections only apply when you're using the markup cost method. If you use discounting off of list or fee, it doesn't matter. These don't matter at all. Basically, whatever you have in the specifications is what you're going to charge the client, i.e. you're always using the always proposal method. Now, if you want a larger or more in-depth discussion on the invoice price settings, be sure to watch our Accounting Course 2, Client Invoices and Billing Reports webinar, where I go into a discussion and a demonstration of those three invoice price methods in great depth. Okay. So that goes over our three standard pricing methods, marking up the cost, discounting off of list, and using a purchasing fee or design fee. Now let's talk of a few different ways we can override our pricing method, predominantly for our Pro Cloud users. The first of which is using the override defaults budget window to specify a sales category for which I want to use a different pricing strategy. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at our Hilson project again. Now I'm going to the budget tab, and you can see I have got two entries created here. Now, more commonly, these entries are used for crafting budgets at the sales category and or location level. So I can specify how much will be spent on furniture or accessories or for the master bedroom or for the kitchen, etc. So the client and I can agree upon those, and the Design Manager can warn me if I approach the budget or even block me, etc. But I'm using them to override my default pricing method for a few different genres or types of goods or services. Let's take a look at the artworks entry I have here. I'm going to edit that. And you can see I've created the entry for a sales category of artwork. I put a little note in there just to remind me what the purpose is. And notice on the right-hand side, I have the override markup option selected. So when that's selected, I then have the ability to set my pricing model for all of my component types, and I can use any one. Just like we did on the project level, I can use any of the pricing types for each of my component types, along with my default or overridden percentages. So as we saw, normally I want to charge 30% when I'm marking up my cost for merchandise. But for artwork, I want to charge 50%, but I'll still use the same 10% for my freight. For antiques, however, I want to mark it up 100%, and I want to have a slightly higher freight markup as those freight or shipping charges may be more. And now notice I can also override the client deposit for various sales categories. So for antiques, maybe I want to always get 100% rather than my traditional 50%. So my override defaults window gives you another layer to properly craft the pricing structure that you want. Let's see how these work. So if we go to our items again, let's add a new one. And let's say this is an antique chair. One each. And I'm going to use my sales category of antiques. Notice the moment that I selected my antiques, my client deposit goes from 50 to 100%. So I'm overriding my standard project default. And now if we use the add button to get down to our component window, rather than my standard 30% that I use for merchandise for this project, I'm automatically marking it up the 100% as I configured in my override default. Let's say our cost here is 2,000. So we can see my markup obviously is simply doubled and my sale price is 4,000. And for freight, recall that I said I'd rather do 20% for my antiques versus 10. So if I select an additional charge of freight, I'm using that overridden default as well. Let's say that's $200. So I can specify certain sales categories to override any of my project settings. So no matter what I have configured for any of my projects, sales category override will take precedence. And there we go. Now, I may wish to use this amended pricing for all of my projects. Well, I can certainly do so. You can set these sales category or overrides at the company information level on the budget tab, and you can see there's my antique and artwork overrides. In fact, perhaps I added those after I have created some projects. I can even then bring those new sales category markup overrides into an existing project just by editing the project, going to that budget tab, and using the refresh list. And that will bring those down. And I can further configure them on a per project basis if I wanted to override my antiques again to add that 100% client deposit in, I could do so. So you have your company standard levels, and then you can customize them on a per project basis as well. If the concept of budgets in ProCloud interests you, be sure to check out our budgets in DM ProCloud, where I go into detail on how those budget entries work as well. Okay, another method for setting your pricing strategy is using vendor markup overrides in the ProCloud. Now, you may have an agreement with a particular vendor or vendors where your company resells or is a representative for a vendor's product line. And as such, you may want to control the pricing for those products for that vendor differently than any other vendor, which would follow some of the other methods we discussed already. So let's take a look at a fictional vendor I created to demonstrate. So on our vendors glossary, I've created my Mudita furniture and fabric vendor. And if we edit them, go to our defaults tab, notice the bottom right quadrant, I have a now very familiar setup where I have all of my component types and I have the ability to change the pricing structure and the associated percentage. So with this vendor, I may have very favorable terms, so I get the merchandise at a discounted rate, so I can mark it up at 60% rather than my more traditional 30% and still give the client a very good savings. Let's see how these vendor markup percentages work. So let's go back to our specifications and we'll add another item. Chair from Mudita Furniture. H furniture. Now, back on our component window, I'm using my project settings of 30% markup. But when I go and put in our Mudita furniture, notice markup immediately changes for me. to that 60%. So I'm using the vendor now to override my project default markup percentages. And let's say this is 800 versus our 1,000 from before. And now we're calculating our sell price and markup at that 60% level and still giving our client a very good and favorable deal there. Now, you may have a situation with the vendor where the vendor provides you with a certain discount off of the list price that determines your cost. And these are known as terms or buying terms, and Design Manager can be configured to use these as well. Let's take a look at our vendor again, back to our defaults. And on the left side, we have a selection of a series of 3 buying terms. And perhaps this vendor is going to give us a discount of 55% off of list. So I'd add that into term 1. Now when I reselect Mudita, notice my buying term selection is automatically selected and my term comes in. Also notice that my unit cost is now disabled. Well, I'm calculating my cost predicated on the list price of the product that I'm buying. So if the unit list here was, let's say, 1,500, that calculates my cost for me. So if I'm getting a discount of 55%, means I'm being charged 45% for $675, and we are. And I'm still marking it up 60% for a sell price in this case of $1,080. So the client can then be shown, well, here's the list price of $1,500, and again, by using us for your design services, you're getting this at a wonderful deal. So I'm using a combination of both my vendor markup overrides and buying terms to calculate my cost and pricing strategy. So you can see how Design Manager really can handle any sophistication that you may have with your terms with your vendor, how you want your pricing to default, etc. Okay, so finally, what pricing defaults takes precedence over the others? Well, we already saw that a sales category override is going to take precedence over the project setting, as will any vendor markups will take precedence over the project settings. But which one of those will take precedence of the other? Let's see. Let's add another item, and let's get an antique chair from Mudita. And I'll use our sales category of antique this time. Go down to our component, and my markup is at the 100% of antiques. Fantastic. But if I put in our vendor, just like that, we get our 60%. So the ultimate winner, or the ultimate highest precedence of markups, goes to the vendor. So no matter if I'm ordering antiques from 100 different vendors, if I get an antique from Mudita, it's always going to use that 60%. So that will override even the sales category overrides. And remember, all of these defaults are just that. You always have full control over what you're charging your client. You can simply input the sell price as desired, 5,000. Let's see, here's our list. I can always change my prices to the client as I see fit. Now, and with that, that brings us to our conclusion of our discussion on all the pricing and override settings in Design Manager today. And I tried to show how Design Manager has a 3-tiered pricing system where you can calculate the price to your client based on either marking up the cost, discounting off of list, or using a purchasing fee based upon the cost of the product. Again, particularly in those Agent Force situations. You can configure Design Manager to default the pricing structure and all of those appropriate percentages at the company level, and then customize them on an individual project basis. And I tried to show for our Pro Cloud users how you can use the sales category and vendor markup overrides to further configure the desired pricing for various classifications of goods and services, or for a particular vendor, respectively. And I thank all of you for joining our discussion today. I hope you attend another of our free webinars in the near future. Take care and have a great day.